Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Reviving the Earth. In our last episode, we had ended with a suggestion that restoration is actually a path to the creation of a new vision for economic activity, a new prospect for what could comprise economic activity for human societies on Earth. And that actually, in referring back to a reference we made earlier from the Quran, from the Surah Al-Isra, where there's a verse which discusses how the wasteful, the squanderers, are seen as being brothers of the devils, of the shayateen, and that this was a quality of those who are ungrateful. And we were asking the question, okay, if wastefulness is associated with ingratitude, and if the wasteful is seen as being the brothers of the devils, as is cited in the translation of that verse, and that Satan, that shaitan, that this figure, Iblis, was ever ungrateful to his Lord, as is cited in the verse, what would be the opposite, the diametrically opposed behavior to remove one from being counted among the ungrateful and the wasteful? Well, this statement that was made in John Lew's remarks in this piece that I was quoting is I would suggest much closer to the mark. That it would also mean that restoration, or to go to the previous sentence, a functional economy would mean that conservation is not considered an expensive luxury, but the way to preserve wealth. That the conservation of nature, at the very least, and that actually the regeneration and the restoration of nature, that actually facilitating its ability to be able to do the job it was made to do, would be the ideal. That this would actually be the source of generating or creating wealth. Because nature in and of itself, by virtue of how it functions and the job and the functionality it provides, is wealth in and of itself. And this would certainly be closer to what is expressed within the Islamic tradition by having verse after verse point to the wonder that is embodied within the creation itself. That it is seen as being something very weighty, seen as being miraculous, something that has been perfected in being created right from the very beginning. So if it's perfected, then it's something that should be valued and something we would seek to help to maintain. If anything, certainly this isn't something that should be seen as something worthy of destruction. So he goes on, it would also mean that restoration of degraded lands would be recognized as a means to increase wealth. Sequestering carbon would be a matter of course rather than an afterthought. Because for one, and reading through the various services and functions that natural systems provide, it's something that it was made to do. That sequestering carbon, that actually storing carbon and making use of carbon, was something that nature is made to do. A functional ecosystem-based economy would be much more fairly distributed because those responsible for maintaining that function, currently those who suffer worst from the degradation inflicted by consumer capitalism. Again, I think it's a false dichotomy between capitalism and communism. That really we're looking at consumer industrialism or consumer industrialization or industrial consumerism. That it would be compensated for restoring and maintaining ecosystem functions. In other words, the populations of people that we see globally that suffer from the current paradigm, which is predicated again on industrialization and consumerism, would in fact most benefit by being engaged in the process of restoring the destruction, which has come from the establishment of the industrial consumerist system. That there is an enormous amount of work that is potentially available for people anywhere and everywhere. We've seen the type of destruction which is increasingly becoming more and more prevalent. That that for as large as the crisis is, there's also a tremendous opportunity provided to put a lot of people to work doing something that is very much worthwhile and is also very much needed. And so this is, again, this is one of those critical points in history in which we actually have an opportunity to do the right thing. The information is available. We are at no shortage of information to give us a very clear picture as to what the state of things happens to be. We are in the information age. That's certainly one of the things that we can say about the world we live in. What might be in question is our ability to be able to assess the information, that there may be too much and that we are not necessarily equipped to make the best use of that information. But at the very least, the information is available. And that there is, again, this incredible chance, this incredible opportunity being presented to actually do the right thing, and that we know precisely what it is that needs to be done because we have the information to inform our actions. Now, there's also another great quote that I wanted to cite, which is provided by I think one of the most influential writers on the about the environment, and also linking the environment to matters related to business. And his name is E.F. Schumacher. And E.F. Schumacher wrote a number of texts in the 1970s, which became actually very influential in the development of the environmental movement and sort of the consciousness of environmental issues. And this book is called Economics as if People, Small is Beautiful, Small is Beautiful, Economics as if People Mattered. And it's a very small but quite powerful book in its ability to summarize, I think, some very big, some very important ideas in relatively few words, which is a testament to his, I think, to his skill as a writer. But there's a portion of the first chapter called The Problem of Production, which again describes what has plagued the very nature of industrialization, the very nature of the industrial worldview. And it's something that we would do well to take into consideration. And it further informs us about what it is we need to do. And he begins in this chapter, it says, literally it's the first chapter of the book. A businessman would not consider a firm to have solved its problems of production and to have achieved viability if he saw that it was consuming its capital. That you cannot be said to be making a profit if the capital which is responsible for you having an economy in the first place is being consumed in the course of making this money. That you can't be said to be making a profit because you would have to replace the capital. How then could we overlook this fact when it comes to that very big firm, the economy of Spaceship Earth, and in particular, the economies of its rich passengers? One reason for overlooking this vital fact is that we are estranged from reality and inclined to treat as valueless everything we have not made ourselves. This actually is a reference to a point that I was making earlier about how we only tend to place value on things that we have created, on our own ideas, and that the industrial world is really a product of that way of thinking. Because in order to make a place for what it is you want to build, you have to remove what was already in place. So if you look at any city, any town, any heavily built up area, that if you go back far enough in history before the establishment of that city or that town, there was just nature there, right? There were trees and there were hills and there were grasses and there were probably myriad animals, myriad different species. There are probably lakes and ponds and rivers, that these places that have now become built up, concreted, asphalt, buildings, big structures, that essentially what you've done is you've transplanted this built infrastructure, which requires a huge amount of energy, requires a huge amount of labor, a lot of work to establish, that you've removed nature in order to make room for this. And this is because you have valued what it is that you have built, that man has built, that human beings has built, and that the inherent wealth, the inherent value of nature is not seen as being important. In fact, it's not seen as having value. Why? Because you haven't built it. And this is a problematic way of looking at the world, and this is what he had expressed here. So he continues, now we have indeed labored to make some of the capital, which today helps to produce a large fund of scientific, technological, and other knowledge, an elaborate physical infrastructure, innumerable types of sophisticated capital equipment, etc. But all this is but a small part of the total capital we are using. Far larger is the capital provided by nature and not by man, and we do not even recognize it as such. This larger part is now being used up at an alarming rate, and that is why it is an absurd and suicidal error to believe and act on the belief that the problem of production has been solved. And again, this speaks to the problem of viewing the troubles that we're experiencing now as a technological problem, because that continually we see these discussions about the key to solving our crisis is to create new technologies. And this is a bit of a elaborate self-delusion, because as long as the focus is always on technology, it will never be placed on the need to address the destructive behavior which has caused all of the trouble that we see. That is really at the root of causing the crisis, the various crises that we're confronted with in the world. And really the problematic behavior is a product of a mistaken understanding of the world in which one finds themselves. That there is a mistaken understanding of what one believes they are experiencing. And then based on that mistaken understanding of their experience, what we end up collectively choosing to do, what the activities that we pursue, takes us further in the wrong direction. And this is something that hopefully we'll be able to address further in the next segment. So please stay with us as we continue to discuss this in detail. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back. We were discussing the problem with the current arrangement and how it's rooted in a mistaken understanding of what it is that we see in the world, like how we envision our role on the planet, and how this has moved us in a particular direction in creating the type of societies, the type of civilizations, which has, instead of valuing and caring for the creation, how we have, again, commodified it and just merely seen it as being a means by which to enrich ourselves, or rather enrich a very small portion of humanity at the expense of everything and everyone else. And that in the creation of this, specifically this industrial worldview, that a lot of this has been facilitated by a valuing of technique and technology. And that there is another great quote from E.F. Schumacher. We had quoted him in the last segment, in the last episode, where he talked about the mistake of not valuing the capital that is provided by nature and only valuing that which has been created by man. And that this is a fundamental error. And this speaks to, again, the ascendancy of looking at technology or technique as having primary value. And this is emblematic of what Schumacher called sort of there's sort of a battling, adversarial relationship between two different ways of looking at the value of science or the use of science. He said in another book that he had written in the late 70s called Guide for the Perplexed, he had written about science for understanding, or the science of understanding, versus the science of manipulation, or the science for manipulation. That science can serve under these two basic rubrics. That you can use your understanding of the mechanics of how things operate to manipulate them, to produce things that you want, whether or not the manner in which you're producing them is actually beneficial. Or you can take this understanding that you have, this scientific understanding you have of the mechanics and the inner workings of nature, and this could be something that actually provides you with an understanding, a better understanding of how it is that you should be functioning within this particular context, within this arrangement. And that industrialization is really a product of the science of manipulation, or science for manipulation. That it's merely a matter of knowing what button to push and what knob to turn in order to produce an output which can be, again, commodified or made into a product or a service to sell people. And this is largely one of the reasons why we find ourselves in the position that we're in now. So in returning to this sort of this meditation on how we steward, or how we're supposed to steward the earth, and especially in reference to pursuing an activity like agriculture. And the reason why I keep coming back to agriculture, because it's a very seminal activity on this planet. It's a very seminal activity for the human species, because it was by means of agriculture that we were able to have civilization develop in the first place. That it was by means of our ability to be able to devise ways of producing relatively large quantities of food from a tract of land, and then having a way to transport these goods to dense population centers that enabled for cities and towns and these civilizational arrangements to occur. Because if you can't provision a place that has a lot of people, then life just simply isn't possible. You can't have that many people live in one place and not be able to supply them with the things that they need in order to live. But obviously, this has resulted in a number of problems. So, in going back to one of the writings that I've been citing in these episodes, I want to go back to W.C. Loudermilk's book, in which he discusses this idea of developing an 11th commandment. And really, this is a return to the discussion of the need to integrate, again, some sort of ethical sensibility in informing what we do. It's very powerful language, and I think it's interesting that someone with expertise in his field at that time was able to identify the problematic nature of historically speaking, as a historical phenomenon. he was able to identify the problematic nature of how we have settled upon ways of managing land. Being that we're in the second decade, in the midst of the second decade of the 21st century, we're only farther down this destructive track that he was so concerned about in the 1930s. And we are in more urgent need of implementing something that is sensible and being able to establish a different order. So if we go back and again, we look at some of the specifics of how we can create a different order. The items that were mentioned in the example from Muslim Spain is actually ideal. It actually highlights the elements that we need to put back into place, but at scale. So again, the first item that was mentioned was the need to value the design of landscape to optimize the intelligent use of water. And so this is mated to, or this should be mated to what was also mentioned in the Moorish example, the Moorish Spain example, of how, say, water and terracing became very important elements in creating the backdrop upon which everything else was built. And this is exactly what it is that we suggest in our own work when we are going to these places that are degraded, is that usually the first thing we look at, the first thing we attempt to assess, is the condition of landscape with relation to how water is managed, how water is used. And that the first practical step is refashioning landscape or conditioning the ground to be able to make best use of water. And then once that has been established, we have the other step that was mentioned, or the other feature that was mentioned about what the Muslims in Spain were able to do, what they implemented. And that was this understanding that they had to return back to the ground those agents. They had to return back to the ground those products, those materials, that nutritive input, which would improve the fertility and the productive capacity of landscape in order for that to continue over long periods of time. That you do not take a deposit. You do not make a withdrawal from landscape without making a deposit. That you have to put something back, and that the product that you put back into the ground is actually making it better, not worse, which is unfortunately something that isn't necessarily an idea that is shared sort of in the conventional wisdom of how a great deal of the management of landscape is pursued now. And this has a lot to do with, again, only considering the products that are made by people, that are made by humans, as having value. So, for example, when we look at conventional industrial agriculture, this is actually seen as being an area of huge economic growth. Again, because there's a projection that due to the proliferation of the anticipated proliferation of populations, that there will be a demand for food. And so because, say stocks that had traditionally been seen as a way of being able to make money in financial markets, for example, whether it be tech stocks or things related to financial institutions, that actually investing in financial dealings related to agriculture, that this was a way to be able to make a healthy profit very quickly. And so we see that a lot of financial institutions that traditionally didn't necessarily pay as much attention to agricultural sort of related matters as they do now. They're now putting in lots of money into companies that make all of the various products which are used in agriculture now. So we're looking at, again, pesticides, a lot of, again, those chemical products, the machinery, the seeds, the production of seeds, proprietary technology or intellectual property that's related to, say, genetically modified organisms or genetically modified seed, that these are seen as being a way of making a financial killing. Even if these products are the manner in which landscapes and people and life is killed. And there's more than enough information that is highlighting this particular problem. But because agriculture is no longer about the production of food, it's about how one can make a lot of money. These things are not seen as being, or these problems are not seen as being problematic. They're not seen as being something worthy of rethinking, because the focus is the product. It is not what the product is made to facilitate. It is the product that can be bought and sold and traded and speculated upon within financial markets. And this is something that eventually is going to have to be faced, because it just can't continue. Things that can't go on forever don't, as someone once famously put it. So this episode can't go on forever, so it won't, but we will be picking up the discussion in the episode to follow, in the segments to follow. So please come back. Assalamu alaikum.